Ayanda lived with her husband Kunal in a grand mansion in Lagos, a house that looked like a palace from the outside. But behind the shining walls, peace was hard to find. Kunal's mother, Madame Dupe, ruled the house with a loud voice and sharp tongue. Every day she threw hurtful words at Ayanda, cutting her confidence little by little. It didn't matter whether family members were visiting or neighbors stopped by. Madame Dupe always found a way to make Ayanda feel small. She called her names, cruel ones that stung like knives. Barren wife, she would sneer, or useless woman, making sure everyone heard. Each insult left Ayanda wounded, but she kept quiet for the sake of her marriage. She tried to be respectful, but the humiliation kept piling up. Day after day, she swallowed her pain and prayed for peace, yet it never came. One afternoon, the house was filled with relatives and family friends. Laughter filled the air until Madame Dupe's voice rose above it all. She looked straight at Ayanda and accused her of being nothing more than a gold digger, claiming she had no right to live in the mansion. The words burned Ayanda's soul. Something inside her snapped that day. Before anyone could stop her, Ayanda stood tall and dragged Madame Dupe out of the living room in front of the stunned guests. Gasps filled the space. Everyone whispered that she would regret this act of defiance, reminding her that the mansion belonged to Dupe's son. Faces turned cold, and the room buzzed with judgment. But then the unexpected happened. A lawyer walked in with a sealed envelope, his serious expression silencing the room. He opened the papers and read out loud, revealing a shocking truth. Kunal's late father had written in his will that the mansion belonged solely to Ayanda. She was the legal owner, not Kunal, not Madame Dupe. The entire atmosphere shifted. Relatives who had mocked her moments before began clapping and praising her strength. Madame Dupe stood frozen, unable to speak, her power slipping away. Ayanda, calm and steady, looked at her mother-in-law and told her to pack her things and leave the house for good. Security moved swiftly, and Madame Dupe was escorted out of the gates she once ruled over. Ayanda then walked through the mansion slowly, her head lifted high. For the first time, she felt the walls truly belonged to her. No longer a guest, no longer silenced, she had reclaimed her dignity and her rightful place. The daily humiliation became Ayanda's painful routine. Madame Dupe never missed a chance to wound her with bitter words. She called her a barren wife, in front of family friends, as if her worth depended only on children. Whenever visitors came, instead of showing warmth, Dupe made Ayanda the target of her cruel tongue. She would shake her head and whisper loudly enough for everyone to hear, labeling her useless, laughing as though it was a joke. But to Ayanda, every insult felt like a heavy stone crushing her heart. Ayanda tried to hide her tears, forcing a smile whenever people were around. But deep inside she felt broken. She wanted peace in her marriage, so she kept silent, hoping her husband would speak up. Kunal often sat quietly, avoiding his mother's drama, leaving Ayanda to fight her battles alone. Each day she felt like a stranger in her own home, walking on eggshells, afraid of what Dupe might say next. When neighbors visited, Dupe would sit proudly in the center of the living room, retelling stories that embarrassed Ayanda. She mocked her cooking, her clothes, even her background, painting her as someone who brought nothing valuable into the family. Guests would chuckle nervously, not knowing how to react, but Ayanda could see the judgment in their eyes. It was as if Dupe wanted to erase every bit of dignity she had left. The humiliation never ended, not even during private dinners. Dupe would raise her voice, asking loudly why her son married a woman who could not give him heirs. The words echoed in Ayanda's head long after the meals ended. At night, she cried quietly in her room, praying for strength, wondering how much longer she could endure such cruelty. Even simple tasks became trials. If she set the table, Dupe criticized the arrangement. If she greeted visitors, Dupe mocked her tone. Nothing she did was ever good enough. And yet, Ayanda remained respectful, never throwing back insults, because she knew losing her temper would only feed Dupe's power. But deep inside, Ayanda's patience was wearing thin. Every insult was pushing her closer to the edge. Each moment of humiliation carved scars that would not fade. Though she held her silence, her heart carried the weight of every cruel word. What Dupe didn't know was that the same insults meant to break Ayanda were slowly building a fire within her, one that would soon change everything. During a family gathering, the mansion was filled with chatter, music, and the smell of food. Relatives laughed, Children ran around, and the evening seemed lively. Ayanda tried to blend in, smiling politely as she served drinks and helped guests settle. But in her heart, she carried the weight of countless insults. She prayed that this day would be different, that maybe peace would last through the night. Then Madame Dupe's voice cut through the air, sharp and cruel. She fixed her eyes on Ayanda and said loudly enough for everyone to hear that she was nothing but a gold digger. The words rolled out like poison. Gasps spread across the room as the older woman went on, mocking her background, saying she had no right to live in the mansion. She claimed Ayanda married Kunnel only for wealth, not for love, making sure her voice echoed so every guest understood. Ayanda froze, her heart pounding. She could feel dozens of eyes staring at her, some in pity, others in judgment. Whispers started among the relatives, and she caught the smirks on a few faces who had always sided with Madame Dupe. The embarrassment burned like fire, but this time, something inside her snapped. For years she had endured the humiliation silently, swallowing tears, hoping for better days. But being called a gold digger in front of everyone, being stripped of her dignity so publicly, was too much to bear. She rose from her seat slowly, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. The room fell quiet, shocked that she dared to stand against Madame Dupe. Ayanda looked directly at her mother-in-law. Her eyes filled with pain but also strength. "I have been patient," she said, her voice clear. "But enough is enough." The crowd held their breath as tension thickened. Dupe scoffed, ready to throw another insult, but Ayanda did not give her the chance. She stepped forward, her presence commanding, and with firm resolve, she confronted the woman who had tormented her endlessly. Guests shifted uncomfortably, not sure if they should interfere or stay silent. The moment felt electric, as though the air itself was waiting for what would come next. This was no longer about words, it was about respect, dignity, and survival. For the first time, Ayanda refused to bow, and everyone in that mansion knew something was about to change forever. Enraged, Ayanda finally lost all control. The living room was full of relatives and friends, but she no longer cared about the stares or whispers. Her heart pounded as Madame Dupe threw yet another insult, smiling proudly as if shaming her daughter-in-law was entertainment. This time, Ayanda refused to stay silent. She stood up with a fire in her eyes that no one had ever seen before. The room fell still, everyone waiting for her next move. Without hesitation, she walked straight to Madame Dupe and grabbed her firmly. Gasps filled the air, hands covered mouths, and chairs scraped as people stood in shock. No one could believe what was happening. Ayanda pulled her out of her seat and dragged her toward the door. The older woman shouted and struggled, but Ayanda's strength came from years of bottled pain. Her voice rang out, steady and powerful, as she declared she would never allow anyone, especially her mother-in-law, to humiliate her again. The guests could not believe their eyes. Some tried to stop her, but the intensity in Ayanda's face froze them in place. She was no longer the quiet, submissive woman they had always mocked. She was fierce, unshaken, and fearless. Each step toward the door felt like justice, every movement a release of all the suffering she had endured. Dupe's voice cracked with rage, shouting threats and curses, but no one moved to help her. Instead, whispers filled the room, shocked voices saying Ayanda had crossed the line, predicting she would regret this moment forever. They muttered that the mansion belonged to Kunnel, not her, and that her boldness would cost her dearly. But Ayanda did not flinch. She tightened her grip and pushed forward, determined to end the cycle of humiliation once and for all. Finally, at the doorway, she turned back to the guest. Her chest rose and fell as she caught her breath, but her words came strong and unshaken. She announced that she would never again tolerate insults under her own roof. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shocked gasps of relatives who could hardly believe what had just taken place. In that moment, Ayanda was no longer seen as a weak wife, but as a woman standing for her dignity. Though many doubted her, though they whispered that she had gone too far, she knew there was no turning back. A storm had been unleashed, and nothing in that mansion would ever be the same again. The gasps and whispers spread through the living room like wildfire. Family members leaned toward each other, murmuring in low voices, shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. Some clutched their beads, others pressed their hands to their chests, unable to believe that Ayanda had dared to drag Madame Dupe out in front of everyone. The tension was so thick it was almost choking. "She will regret this," one aunt muttered under her breath, loud enough for others to hear. How can she challenge the woman who raised the owner of this house? Another uncle whispered that she had just destroyed her marriage, that no wife could ever survive after embarrassing her mother-in-law in such a public way. The cousin snickered, whispering that the house was never hers to claim anyway. It belonged to Cunnel, Madame Dupe's son, and by extension, still under Dupe's control. Ayanda stood in the middle of the whispers, her chest rising and falling as the crowd's judgment washed over her. She could hear every cruel word, each one trying to pierce her confidence. Some eyes looked at her with pity, others with amusement, but most were filled with disapproval. They were certain she had made the worst mistake of her life. Madame Dupe, catching her breath near the doorway, smirked through her anger. She straightened her wrapper, lifted her chin, and with a bitter laugh declared that Ayanda had no power here. "This mansion belongs to my son," she said boldly, making sure every guest heard. Her voice carried like a trumpet, filled with venom and pride. A wave of agreement rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded, lips whispered, and many believed her words as truth. But Ayanda remained silent, her face unreadable. Inside, her heart beat wildly. Yet there was a quiet strength holding her up. She had endured too much to crumble now. The whispers continued, circling around her like vultures waiting for her downfall. One believed the story was finished, that she would soon kneel in apology or be forced out of the house in shame. Yet, beneath the heavy murmurs, an unseen shift was already on the horizon. Something no one expected was about to rewrite the story. The whispers of doubt that filled the room were only moments away from being silenced forever. The same crowd that mocked her was about to witness a revelation that would leave their mouths wide open in shock. That a lawyer arrived unexpectedly, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor as he stepped into the crowded living room. The sight of him carrying a brown envelope in his hand froze the entire gathering. Conversations stopped, laughter died, and every pair of eyes turned toward him. The timing felt strange, almost like destiny had pushed him through the door at the exact moment tension was at its highest. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and greeted everyone politely. His calm, professional tone stood in sharp contrast to the heated atmosphere. Guests exchanged puzzled glances, wondering why he had come on such a night, holding papers that looked official and important. Even Madame Dupe's mocking smile faltered for a moment. She frowned, clearly unsettled by his sudden arrival, though she quickly tried to mask it with a scoff. Ayanda stood still, her heart racing. She had no idea what this man had brought with him, but something about his serious expression told her it mattered. Cunnel shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his mother, then back at the lawyer. No one spoke. The silence was so heavy that even the children playing earlier had stopped to watch. The lawyer raised the envelope slightly and announced that he carried sealed documents concerning the ownership of the mansion. The words dropped like thunder, sending shockwaves through the room. A ripple of whispers spread instantly, some gasping, others questioning what he meant. Faces turned pale, and tension grew even sharper. Madame Dupe stiffened, clutching the edge of her wrapper as though bracing herself. Every guest leaned forward, desperate to know the contents of the envelope. The lawyer carefully broke the seal, his movements slow and deliberate, making the suspense unbearable. Ayanda could barely breathe as he unfolded the papers, scanning them before lifting his head to speak. The room remained frozen, not a single sound escaping. It was as if time itself had paused, waiting for his revelation. Everyone who had whispered against Ayanda minutes ago now sat in anxious silence, unsure of what was about to be revealed. The lawyer cleared his throat once more, preparing to deliver the truth that would either confirm their beliefs or shatter them completely. In that moment, the air inside the mansion grew heavier than ever. All eyes were locked on the man with the documents, knowing that whatever he said next would change everything forever. The lawyer revealed the truth with a steady voice that cut through the silence like a blade. He read from the document, explaining that Cunnel's late father had left a clear will. Every word made the crowd lean closer, their hearts pounding. Then came the bombshell. This mansion, the very one they all believed belonged to Cunnel, had not been left to him at all. Instead, it was written that Ayanda was the rightful and only legal owner. The announcement landed like thunder in the room. Gasps echoed as jaws dropped, and the whispers from earlier turned into stunned silence. People looked at one another in disbelief, trying to process what they had just heard. Some blinked rapidly, thinking they had misheard, while others pressed their palms to their mouths, too shocked to speak. Ayanda stood frozen, her mind racing, hardly able to believe what had just been declared. She felt her knees weaken, but strength rose within her. All the humiliation, all the insults, all the moments she had been treated as if she was nothing. Suddenly they didn't matter anymore. The very ground she was standing on belonged to her. Madame Dupe's face turned pale, her confidence collapsing in an instant. The smirk she had carried all evening disappeared as if it had been wiped off with one stroke. She opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. Her eyes widened, darting between the lawyer and the papers, desperate to deny what had just been revealed, yet unable to fight the written proof. Guests who had mocked Ayanda minutes before now shifted uncomfortably, their shame written on their faces. Some quickly began to clap, praising the late father's wisdom and Ayanda's hidden strength. The very people who once whispered against her now tried to align themselves with her, showering her with fake admiration. Ayanda, however, stood tall in the middle of it all. She took a deep breath and let the words sink in. She was not a guest in this house. She was not a woman clinging to her husband's name. She was the owner, the one chosen by the man who built it all. The bombshell had flipped the entire story upside down, and the power that once rested in Madame Dupe's hands had vanished forever. The mansion was hers, legally and undeniably, and everyone watching knew that nothing would ever return to how it was before. Guests who once mocked her now applauded her courage, their claps echoing through the living room like thunder. Only moments earlier, they had whispered that she would regret standing up to Madame Dupe, but now their voices were filled with praise. Some rose to their feet, nodding in respect, while others called her strong and brave. The same mouths that had labeled her weak now celebrated her boldness. The entire atmosphere shifted, and for the first time, Ayanda felt the weight of support surrounding her instead of ridicule. She stood gracefully, her eyes glistening but steady, listening as people who had once doubted her now spoke words of admiration. Aunts who had joined in Dupe's mockery earlier leaned forward, pretending they had always been on her side. Cousins who had laughed at her pain now smiled brightly, eager to be associated with her. Their sudden change of heart was obvious, but Ayanda didn't let it distract her. She knew who had truly stood against her, and she would never forget. Madame Dupe, however, remained frozen. Her lips trembled, but no words escaped. The powerful woman who had once dominated every conversation, who had shouted insults without hesitation, was now silent. Her eyes darted helplessly, as though searching for an escape. She opened her mouth once, then shut it quickly, too stunned to argue against the legal truth that had stripped her of all authority. The humiliation that Dupe had always thrown on Ayanda now turned back on her. Guests whispered, not about Ayanda anymore, but about Dupe's arrogance and cruelty. Some shook their heads at her behavior, saying she had brought this downfall upon herself. Her once commanding presence now seemed small, fragile, and powerless. Ayanda walked a few steps forward, her posture tall and proud. Every clap, every word of support lifted her spirit higher. She no longer felt like the woman who had been silenced for years. She had found her voice, and it rang louder than any insult ever thrown at her. The power dynamic had shifted completely. What had once been a night of humiliation turned into a moment of triumph. The same people who thought she would fall were now witnesses to her rise. And as Madame Dupe stood speechless, Ayanda knew the tables had truly turned, and the respect she deserved could never again be taken from her. Ayanda calmly stood in the center of the room, her face steady and her voice firm. She no longer needed to shout to be heard. Every eye was on her, waiting to see what she would do next. The lawyer's words had already sealed her victory, but she knew the battle was not complete until she made her stand clear. She turned toward Madame Dupe, who still looked shaken and pale, and with quiet authority, she declared that the era of insults was over. Her tone carried strength, not anger, and that made her words even more powerful. She told Dupe that she could no longer stay in the mansion, that the days of controlling and humiliating her were finished forever. Gasps filled the room once again, but this time no one argued. The will had spoken, the truth was out, and Ayanda's right could not be questioned. Madame Dupe's eyes widened in disbelief. She clutched at her wrapper, stammering, trying to find her voice, but nothing came out that could change her fate. She looked around at the guests, hoping someone would defend her, but instead, she saw faces turned away. No one wanted to challenge Ayanda now. No one wanted to stand on the losing side. Ayanda lifted her hand gently, signaling the security staff standing near the entrance. The men stepped forward, their footsteps echoing in the silent room. The once proud mother-in-law backed away, muttering under her breath, but her resistance was weak. Security flanked her, guiding her toward the doors she had once walked through with such pride. Each step she took out of that mansion felt like the closing of a long, bitter chapter. Guests whispered again, but their words were no longer about Ayanda's downfall. They were about her strength. They marveled at how she had carried herself with dignity and composure. Some nodded in respect, while others clapped quietly as the drama reached its end. When the doors finally closed behind Madame Dupe, silence returned, heavy but peaceful. Ayanda stood taller than ever, her chest rising with relief. She had not only defended her dignity, but had also reclaimed her home. What had once been a prison of humiliation had become her place of freedom. With Dupe gone, the mansion no longer echoed with insults. Instead, it carried the sound of victory, marking the beginning of a new life where Ayanda's respect could never again be stolen. Ayanda finally walked through the mansion with her head high, her step slow and steady as though she was taking in the place for the very first time. The same halls where she had once felt small now seemed to welcome her. Every wall, every corner, every room carried memories of the insults she had endured. But tonight those wounds began to heal. She was no longer treated as an outsider. She was no longer the woman who had been mocked and silenced. She was the rightful owner, and the entire house seemed to recognize her authority. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing loudly in the silence. Relatives who had doubted her earlier now stood aside respectfully, their heads lowered, making way for her. The same guests who had laughed at her pain hours ago now watched with admiration. Some even smiled nervously, eager to be in her good graces. But Ayanda didn't need their approval anymore. She had found her own strength, and it was more powerful than any fake support. As she walked through the living room, she ran her hand lightly along the edge of the furniture. For so long she had cared for the house, always treated as if she didn't belong, but now every piece belonged to her. She moved past the dining area, remembering all the nights she had cried quietly after harsh words were thrown at her. And she smiled faintly, knowing those nights were behind her forever.